like any other, as mundane and predictable as a Monday could be. The muted hum of a distant lawnmower drifted through the thin walls of Leah's small apartment, mingling with the faint clatter of her spoon tapping against a bowl of oatmeal. The sky outside the window was a soft, unremarkable gray, not stormy or sunny, just overcast, the kind of weather that seemed neither here nor there, a perfect backdrop for a day spent indoors. Leah sat at her kitchen table, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone with one hand while stirring her oatmeal with the other. The screen flickered with headlines and posts, most of them forgotten as soon as they were read. She paused briefly at a video about a new minimalist organization hack, one she knew she'd never try, and moved on to an article about productivity tips she was sure she already knew. Her apartment was small, but comfortably lived in, decorated in a way that suggested someone who cared about their space without having much time or money to invest in it. A string of fairy lights sagged slightly above the couch, their bulbs dulled with dust. A bookshelf in the corner overflowed with paperbacks, some stacked horizontally on top of others, creating a precarious tower of unread novels and impulse buys. The air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender, a mix of her morning routine and the candle she always lit while working. The space suited her. It was quiet and unassuming, much like Leah herself. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she spent most of her days alone, toggling between Photoshop and YouTube tutorials. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and let her set her own hours. On good days, she felt proud of the freedom she had carved out for herself. On bad days, the isolation gnawed at her, but she tried not to think about that too much. The faint buzzing of her phone broke the monotony of her morning. A text from her friend Cassie popped up on the screen. "Are you alive? Haven't heard from you since Friday." Leah smiled faintly and replied with a quick, "Still kicking, just busy with work. You?" Cassie's reply came almost immediately. "Ugh, same. Let's hang out soon. I need to vent about my boss before I lose my mind." Leah typed back, "This weekend, drinks on me." She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, gazing at the window. The view was nothing spectacular, just the neighboring apartment building, its brick walls marred by water stains and graffiti. A pigeon waddled along the edge of the fire escape, its head bobbing as it pecked at something invisible. Leah watched it for a moment, her mind wandering in that aimless way it often did when she was trying to avoid thinking too hard about anything. Her attention drifted back to her laptop, which sat open on the table, waiting for her to resume the project she'd abandoned last night. It was a branding overhaul for a small local bakery, a client she actually liked. The brief was straightforward, and the deadline was generous, but Leah couldn't summon the energy to dive back in just yet. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 10:47 a.m., still early enough to procrastinate a little longer. She reached for her phone again, intending to skim through social media for a few more minutes. Instead, her finger hesitated above the screen, as if her subconscious had caught wind of some unspoken warning. She stared at her reflection in the black screen for a moment before unlocking it, half expecting to find some urgent notification waiting for her. But there was nothing, just the same carousel of apps and icons she saw every day. Leah let out a small laugh at herself and shook her head. "Too much coffee," she muttered aloud, though she hadn't had more than a single cup. Setting the phone aside again, she made a mental note to text Cassie back later with a solid plan for the weekend. Something casual, something normal. The day stretched on uneventfully. Leah worked in fits and starts, her focus slipping in and out as the hours blurred together. She paused to make tea around noon, then forgot about it until she found the mug, cold and abandoned, on the counter at 2. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had cleared, and sunlight filtered weakly through the window, illuminating corners of her notebook doodles. By the time evening arrived, the city outside had settled into its usual rhythm. The distant murmur of traffic rose and fell like a tide, accompanied by the occasional bark of a dog or the laughter of kids playing in the alley. Leah stood in her kitchen, watching a pot of pasta boil and listening to a true crime podcast on her Bluetooth speaker. The narrator's voice was calm and detached, recounting the details of a decades-old case with an almost clinical precision. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away from the stove. It was another text, but this time from an unknown number. Leah frowned, swiping to open it. The message was short. Ever wondered where the internet really ends? For a moment, she just stared at the screen, her brow furrowed. A prank, probably. Someone with too much time on their hands and access to her number. Maybe an old client or a bored acquaintance. She deleted the text without replying and went back to stirring her pasta. The evening passed quietly, and by the time Leah climbed into bed, she had nearly forgotten about the strange message. The room was dark and still, save for the faint glow of her phone charging on the nightstand. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts drifted lazily from one inconsequential topic to another. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of her mind, a tiny voice whispered that she should have replied. But to what end? It was just another blip in a sea of digital noise, no different from the spam emails and unsolicited ads she deleted every day. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, the phone still softly glowing beside her, the faintest hum of possibility lingering in the air. The next morning unfolded much the same as the one before it. Leah's alarm buzzed at 7:30, its sharp trills slicing through the heavy silence of her bedroom. She hit snooze once, then twice, before finally dragging herself out of bed and into the familiar rhythm of her morning routine. Shower, coffee, oatmeal, scroll. The text from the unknown number hadn't crossed her mind since she deleted it. Her phone, as always, was a steady stream of trivial updates and benign distractions. Cassie had sent another message, this time confirming their plans for Saturday. Leah responded with a thumbs-up emoji, her focus already shifting to the growing list of tasks for the day. The bakery project was due soon, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't let it spill into the weekend. Outside, the world continued its steady hum. The sun had broken through the haze, casting the apartment in soft golden light. Leah had always found the early hours comforting. The muted sounds of the city waking up were a reminder that life was happening all around her, even when she was tucked away in her little corner of it. By mid-morning, she was at her desk, hunched over her laptop with a cup of lukewarm coffee beside her. She had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, her hands moving almost automatically as she adjusted colors, fine-tuned typography, and rearranged elements on the screen. The bakery's new logo, a simple, cheerful design with a pastel palette, was finally starting to take shape. It was only when she paused to stretch her stiff shoulders that she noticed something odd. Her phone, lying face up on the desk, had lit up with a notification. Not a text or an email, just a small banner at the top of the screen that read, "You have one new message." The wording struck her as strange. It wasn't from any app she recognized, and the notification disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. When she unlocked her phone, there was nothing to indicate where it had come from. For a moment, Leah stared at the blank screen, her mind flipping through the possibilities. A glitch, maybe, or one of those spam apps she'd forgotten to delete. She brushed it off and went back to work, telling herself it was nothing worth worrying about. But as the day wore on, little things kept tugging at the edges of her attention. A faint, irregular tapping noise from somewhere in the apartment that stopped every time she tried to track it down. The way her internet seemed to lag, for subject lines that read like fragments of a conversation. Did you see it? Where does it lead? She deleted them without opening the attachments, if there even were any. Something about them felt off, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Probably just spam, she told herself again. Weird, sure, but not unusual in the grand scheme of the internet. By the time Leah broke for dinner, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across her living room. She sat at the kitchen table with a plate of reheated leftovers, scrolling absent-mindedly through her feed as she ate. The faint unease she'd felt earlier was still there, but muted now, almost forgotten in the haze of another long, uneventful day. Her phone buzzed again, startling her enough that she nearly dropped her fork. This time, it was a text from the same unknown number as before. The message was short, almost innocuous. Have you started looking yet? Leah frowned, the fork suspended midair. She stared at the words, trying to parse their meaning. There was no context, no reference point, nothing to explain what this person, or whatever it was, might be talking about. Against her better judgment, she typed out a response. Who is this? The reply came almost instantly, the screen lighting up before she even had a chance to set the phone down. You'll find out. Leah's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to laugh it off. Someone was messing with her. A prank, probably. Maybe one of Cassie's co-workers, or someone from her old high school who'd gotten her number somehow. People did things like this for fun, didn't they? She deleted the thread and blocked the number, trying to ignore the uneasy flicker at the back of her mind. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but Leah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She double-checked her locks before bed, something she hadn't done in weeks. And when she climbed under the covers, she found herself staring at the ceiling again, her mind looping back to that strange text and the blank emails. It was probably nothing. Just a coincidence, she told herself as she rolled over and closed her eyes. She had more important things to think about, like finishing the bakery project and figuring out what to wear for drinks with Cassie. But as the apartment settled into silence, the hum of the fridge and the distant whine of traffic seemed louder than usual. And when Leah finally drifted off to sleep, her phone buzzed faintly on the nightstand, the screen flashing once before fading back into darkness. The next day passed with an almost eerie normalcy. Leah woke up to her alarm, groggy but determined to shake off the strange events of the day before. She made her bed, shuffled into the kitchen, and brewed her usual cup of coffee. The sun was out again, casting a warm, inviting glow over the apartment. For a moment, it felt as though the unease lingering in her chest might finally lift. She spent the morning working through revisions on the bakery project, her focus sharp as she refined the logo's details. The soft tap of her keyboard filled the quiet space, occasionally interrupted by the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking or the shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. The ordinary sounds of her apartment building grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't alone, even if she felt that way sometimes. By the time Leah paused for lunch, her earlier discomfort had faded to a dull memory. She turned on a podcast, an upbeat one this time, about travel and cooking, and set to work making a simple sandwich. As she sliced through a tomato, she noticed how the knife caught the light, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the counter. It was the kind of small, inconsequential detail that usually brought her a quiet sense of joy, but today, it only made her feel oddly detached, as if she were observing herself from a distance. Her phone buzzed once, then twice, breaking her reverie. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and glanced at the screen. 2 notifications. The first was from Cassie, confirming their weekend plans. Can't wait for Saturday. What time should we meet? The second, though, was from an unknown sender. Did Did you check your history? Leah froze, her thumb hovering over the message. The words were simple, but something about them set her teeth on edge. She stared at the text for a moment before tapping it open. There was no context, no follow-up, just that cryptic question. She quickly deleted it and blocked the number again, her stomach tightening with unease. Still, she tried not to let it bother her. People got weird messages all the time, didn't they? It was probably just some bot or spammer, or maybe even a prank. She told herself this over and over as she finished her lunch, though the explanation felt increasingly hollow with each repetition. By mid-afternoon, the sky outside had darkened with heavy clouds, casting deep shadows across her apartment. Leah had been working steadily for hours, her focus narrowing to the point where she barely noticed the shifting light. But when the sound of a soft knock echoed from somewhere nearby, her hands froze on the keyboard. She glanced toward the front door, half expecting to see a delivery notice or an envelope slid under the crack. But nothing was there. A few seconds passed, then another knock, this time softer, almost hesitant, like it came from somewhere deeper within the apartment. Leah frowned and stood, her bare feet padding across the wooden floor as she made her way toward the source of the sound. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the weak glow of a single bulb near the bathroom. She hesitated, listening intently, but the knock didn't come again. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard another sound, a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. Her heart skipped. She scanned the hallway, her eyes darting toward the closed doors of her bedroom and the small laundry closet. Both were shut, as they always were. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, she reached out and pushed open the bedroom door. The room was as she'd left it, the bed neatly made, her laptop charger coiled on the nightstand, a sweater draped over the back of a chair. Still, the unease refused to leave her. Leah checked the closet, even though she knew how silly it felt. It was empty, save for the usual clutter of jackets, shoes, and the suitcase she hadn't used in years. She tried to laugh at herself as she closed the door, but the sound came out thin and strained. The rest of the day dragged on in quiet discomfort. Leah's focus on work faltered, her eyes darting to the dark corners of the room more often than she cared to admit. By the time evening fell, the apartment felt heavier, the once comforting silence now oppressive. As she stood at the sink washing dishes after dinner, Leah caught movement in her peripheral vision. She turned quickly, her breath hitching, but it was only the reflection of her own shadow in the window above the sink, distorted by the dim light of the kitchen. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Later that night, when Leah finally crawled into bed, she checked her phone one last time. Cassie had sent a few cheerful texts about their plans, which she responded to with an effort at normalcy. But when she opened her browser to check a recipe she'd bookmarked earlier, something strange caught her eye. Her search history was blank, not just empty, but wiped entirely, as if she'd never searched for anything at all. Her stomach dropped as she stared at the screen, her mind racing to explain it. Maybe it was a bug, or she'd accidentally cleared it herself at some point. That had to be it. But even as Leah set the phone down and turned off the light, she couldn't shake the growing sense that something, or someone, was intruding into the quiet corners of her life. Leah's week unfolded in a fog of uneasy normalcy. The days blended together, punctuated by small, inexplicable moments that made her second-guess herself. At first, she managed to brush them off. Life was full of strange coincidences, wasn't it? A misplaced item, a flickering light, a half-remembered thought. None of it really meant anything. On Wednesday morning, as she stood in the kitchen waiting for her coffee to brew, she noticed the post-it notes on the fridge. They were her reminders, appointments, deadlines, occasional motivational quote. But now, there was a new one. The handwriting was hers, slanted and looping, but she didn't remember writing it. It simply said, "Don't ignore this." She stared at it for a long time, her stomach twisting in quiet unease. Maybe she had written it late at night and forgotten. That seemed plausible enough. She peeled it off and crumpled it, tossing it into the trash before taking her coffee back to her desk. Later that day, as she worked on a new layout for the bakery project, she felt her internet lag again. The pages took seconds longer to load, and sometimes they wouldn't load at all. She frowned, refreshing the page, then checking her Wi-Fi connection. Everything seemed fine, but when she glanced at the browser's search bar, her breath caught. The autocomplete was filling itself in, letter by letter, spelling out, "Where are you looking?" Her hand hovered over the keyboard for a moment, her mind racing through explanations. A prank, a virus. She closed the browser, trying to ignore the way her fingers trembled as she reached for her coffee. The liquid inside had gone cold, but she drank it anyway, desperate for something grounding. That night, Cassie called. It was a relief to hear her voice, bright and casual, cutting through the heaviness that had settled over Leah's apartment. They talked about work, shared half-hearted complaints about deadlines, and debated which bar to meet at on Saturday. For the first time in days, Leah felt normal again. "You sound off," Cassie said eventually, her voice softening. "Are you okay?" Leah hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid. "Yeah," she said finally. "Just tired, I guess." Cassie didn't push, but before they hung up, she said, "You know you can tell me if something's wrong, right?" Leah nodded, even though Cassie couldn't see her. "I know." The next morning, the knocking started again. It was faint, rhythmic, and persistent, like a clock ticking just out of sync. Leah was at her desk, deep into another design revision, when she heard it. At first, she thought it was coming from the front door, but when she checked, the hallway was empty. She sat back down, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled over her. The sound came again, this time softer, like it was coming from the walls themselves. She pressed her ear to the plaster, listening. Nothing. But the moment she stepped away, the knocking resumed, faint and insistent. By Friday, Leah was running on little sleep. The knocking had continued sporadically throughout the week, always at odd hours, always stopping just as she tried to track it down. She was starting to feel foolish, jumping at every sound and shadow. She tried to lose herself in work, in podcasts, in mindless scrolling. But the feeling that something was wrong clung to her, heavy and inescapable. That afternoon, she decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air might clear her head. The streets were quiet, the sidewalks damp from a brief rain shower earlier in the day. Leah wandered aimlessly, letting the rhythm of her steps distract her from the noise in her mind. She found herself drawn to the park a few blocks away, a small patch of green surrounded by towering apartment buildings. It was a place she used to visit often, back when she first moved to the city, but she hadn't been in months. The trees were bare now, their branches tangled against the gray sky. A few joggers passed by, their footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. Leah sat on a bench near the edge of the park, watching a group of children play on the swings. For a moment, she felt almost at peace. But then, as she glanced at the sidewalk leading back to her apartment, she saw something, or someone, standing just beyond the trees. The figure was still, half obscured by the shadows of the branches. Leah squinted, her breath catching in her throat. It was too far away to make out any details, just a vague silhouette, unnervingly motionless. She told herself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a stranger pausing to check their phone. But as she stood to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. By the time Leah got back to her apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across her living room. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. She was fine. Everything was fine. Just a little sleep-deprived, a little jumpy. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, half expecting another message from Cassie. But it wasn't Cassie. "You can't avoid it forever." Leah stared at the screen, her pulse thundering in her ears. The message didn't come from a number this time, just an empty space where the sender's name should have been. Her hands shook as she deleted it, her mind racing through every explanation she could think of. None of them made sense. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the knocking returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room. The days following the night, Leah heard the knocking inside her room blurred together in a haze of sleeplessness and strained calm. She spent more and more time at her desk, forcing herself to focus on work, trying to convince herself that her mind was playing tricks on her. But even as she clung to her routine, the signs that something was wrong crept in like shadows stretching with the setting sun. It started with her belongings, small, everyday items not being where she was certain she had left them. The remote control vanished from the coffee table, only to reappear neatly placed on her nightstand hours later. A pen she'd been using rolled off her desk and seemed to disappear completely, only to show up 2 days later in her bathroom cabinet. Leah wanted to believe she was just distracted, absent-mindedly moving things around without realizing it. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore the tightening knot of anxiety in her chest. One morning, as she stood at the sink brushing her teeth, she noticed something strange in the mirror. The reflection of the bathroom door behind her, slightly ajar, didn't match what she saw when she turned around. In the mirror, it was closed, the edge of the door frame perfectly aligned with the wall. But when she glanced over her shoulder, the door hung open just enough to reveal the dark hallway beyond. Her breath caught, and she blinked hard, gripping the edge of the sink for support. When she looked again, the reflection and the reality were the same. The door was ajar, just as it had always been. She shook her head, trying to shake off the creeping unease. It was a trick of the light, she told herself, a distortion. Mirrors could be strange like that. But as Leah went about her day, she found herself glancing at reflective surfaces more often. Windows, her laptop screen, the stainless steel of her fridge. And every time, she braced herself, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Something watching. When Saturday finally came, Leah was almost relieved to leave her apartment. Meeting Cassie felt like a lifeline, a chance to ground herself in normalcy again. The bar was crowded, the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses providing a welcome distraction from the oppressive quiet of her home. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Cassie said, sliding a cocktail across the table toward her. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Leah hesitated, wrapping her fingers around the cold glass. The urge to spill everything, to confess the strange messages, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, bubbled up inside her. But what could she say that wouldn't make her sound completely paranoid? "I've just been stressed," she said finally. "Work's been a lot." Cassie gave her a skeptical look, but didn't press. Instead, she launched into a story about her overbearing boss, her voice rising and falling with animated frustration. Leah smiled and nodded in the right places, grateful for the distraction. By the time they parted ways, the city had settled into the quiet hum of late-night traffic. occasional car passing by, or a couple huddled together beneath the glow of a street lamp. As she approached her building, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Across the street, a figure stood in the shadow of a doorway. Leah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't step into the light. It was too dark to make out any features, but she could feel its gaze on her, heavy and unblinking. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep walking. It's nothing, she told herself. Just someone waiting for a ride or taking a break from the bar nearby. But she didn't look back. When Leah finally stepped into her apartment, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. She locked the door behind her, flipping the deadbolt twice for good measure, and leaned against it, her pulse racing. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Even the low hum of the fridge seemed muted, swallowed up by the stillness. Leah turned on every light as she moved through the space, her breath hitching at every shadow that shifted or stretched. When she reached her bedroom, she stopped in the doorway, her hand hovering over the light switch. The faint glow from the hallway spilled into the room, casting pale light over the bed, the dresser, the chair in the corner. Everything was as she'd left it, except for the mirror. The standing mirror in the corner of the room reflected her doorway and the hallway behind her. But something was off. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't moving. While Leah stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the room, her reflection stood perfectly still, staring back at her. She blinked, and it was gone, her reflection moving naturally again, mimicking the small, startled movements of her hands. Leah stumbled back, slamming the light switch on and flooding the room with bright, artificial light. The mirror looked normal now, her reflection wide-eyed and pale, but otherwise unremarkable. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, every creak of the floorboards or groan of the pipes setting her nerves on edge. Whatever was happening, whatever she'd been trying to ignore, wasn't going away, and she was beginning to think it was only just starting. Leah tried to settle into her usual routine the next day, clinging to the familiar rhythm of work and small, repetitive tasks. The morning passed quietly. She answered emails, finalized a project draft, and even went for a walk to the cafe down the street. For a few hours, she convinced herself things were normal, but that fragile sense of normalcy didn't last. The first unsettling moment came just after lunch. She was sitting at her desk, adjusting the kerning on a client's logo, when her computer screen flickered. It was brief, barely a second, but enough to make her pause. She glanced at her laptop, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. A momentary glitch, she decided, brushing it off. But as she returned her focus to the design, something caught her eye. A folder had appeared on her desktop, one she hadn't created. Its name was simple. Look. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. She didn't remember creating a new folder. Maybe it was a system update, or some file she'd accidentally downloaded. She double-clicked it, half expecting it to be empty. Inside, there was only one file, a text document. Its name was a string of numbers, random and meaningless at a glance. She opened it, her curiosity outweighing her unease. The file contained only one line of text. Have you figured it out yet? Her chest tightened. She stared at the screen, willing the words to change, to resolve themselves into something logical. But they didn't. Her first instinct was to delete the file, to erase it and move on. But when she dragged the folder to the trash, an error message popped up. This file is currently in use. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. How could it be in use? She hadn't opened anything else. She shut the laptop with a sharp snap, her pulse racing. Maybe it was some kind of sense. She'd download an antivirus program later, clear out whatever was causing this. For now, she needed to get out of her apartment. She grabbed her jacket and keys and left, the door locking firmly behind her. The city felt different that day. The streets were quieter, the usual background hum of traffic and conversation strangely subdued. Leah wandered aimlessly, stopping at a bookstore and a thrift shop, trying to shake the feeling that something was pressing down on her. She found herself lingering in the aisles of the bookstore longer than usual, her fingers brushing over the spines of novels and memoirs she had no intention of buying. The calm, measured atmosphere of the place was comforting, a bubble of normalcy she didn't want to leave. She picked up a book she'd read years ago, an old mystery with a frayed cover, and carried it to the counter. As the cashier rang it up, Leah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out absent-mindedly, expecting another message from Cassie, but froze when she saw the screen. The notification was from her calendar app, but instead of a reminder for an appointment or deadline, it was a single word: soon. She stared at it, her breath catching. The cashier cleared his throat, jolting her back to the present. She fumbled to pay and left the store, clutching the book tightly against her chest, as if it could shield her from the creeping unease. Back at her apartment, Leah's phone buzzed again the moment she stepped through the door. This time, it was a text, from the same nameless sender as before. "It's closer than you think." She dropped her keys onto the counter with a clatter and locked the door behind her, twisting the deadbolt until it couldn't turn any further. Her hands were trembling, but she forced herself to take deep breaths, to calm down. The messages, the folder, the calendar, it was all connected. Someone was trying to scare her. That much was obvious. But why? And how were they doing it? The rest of the evening passed in a tense blur. Leah avoided her laptop, the screen's blank stare a constant reminder of the strange file she couldn't delete. She busied herself with small tasks, washing dishes, tidying up the living room, organizing her bookshelf. But the unease followed her, growing with every creak of the floorboards and rustle of wind against the windows. By the time she crawled into bed, her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, she woke to the sound of faint scratching. It was soft, almost tentative, like fingernails dragging against wood. Leah froze, her breath shallow as she strained to listen. The sound was coming from the direction of her closet. She lay still for what felt like an eternity, her heart hammering in her chest. The scratching stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. She turned her head slowly, her eyes darting toward the closed closet door. It was open, just a crack. She couldn't remember leaving it that way. Leah sat frozen in the dark, the faint sliver of her closet door ajar like an unspoken invitation. The room felt different, heavier somehow, as if the air itself were holding its breath. She told herself to look away, to close her eyes and ignore it, but she couldn't. Her gaze stayed locked on that thin line of shadow, waiting for something to move within it. Nothing did. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt slippery, unreal, as Leah lay there, her body tense and unmoving beneath the blanket. The scratching sound didn't return, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on her, filling her ears until her own heartbeat sounded deafening. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. The next morning, the closet door was closed, perfectly shut, as if it had never been open at all. Leah stood in front of it, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't remember getting out of bed to close it, but maybe she had. Maybe, half asleep and disoriented, and shut it without realizing. That was the logical explanation, wasn't it? She didn't open the door to check. Instead, she turned away, grabbing her phone from the nightstand and heading into the kitchen. The bright morning light streaming through the windows was a welcome reprieve, a reminder that the world outside was still solid and normal. Her coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the apartment with the familiar scent of brewing coffee. Leah leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while the machine worked. There were no new messages, no strange notifications. For the first time in days, her inbox and lock screen were mercifully ordinary. But as she reached for her mug, her thumb brushed against the search bar on her phone, and the keyboard popped up. The autocomplete filled in the bar before she could stop it. "Have you looked inside?" The mug slipped from her hand, clattering against the counter and spilling coffee onto the floor. Leah stared at the screen, her pulse racing. She deleted the text in the bar, her fingers trembling, and turned the phone face down on the counter. She spent the rest of the morning trying to shake the unease, throwing herself into cleaning. She scrubbed the counters, vacuumed the living room rug, and even organized her pantry. Anything to keep herself occupied. But no matter how much she distracted herself, the words kept looping in her mind. "Have you looked inside?" She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd typed the phrase herself at some point, and her phone was just pulling it from her history. But she couldn't remember ever searching for those words. And why now, of all times? By the afternoon, Leah couldn't take it anymore. She found herself standing in front of the closet again, her hand on the handle. She told herself it was just a closet. There was nothing inside but clothes and shoes and old boxes. She checked it 100 times before. It was just a normal, mundane space. But as she turned the handle and pulled the door open, a chill ran down her spine. The closet was as it should have been. Her jackets hung neatly on their hangers, her shoes lined up on the floor. But the air inside felt different, colder somehow. Leah reached in, her fingers brushing against the fabric of a coat. There was nothing unusual, no hidden compartments, no strange objects. She exhaled a shaky breath and shut the door, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. That night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like claws raking against the inside of the walls. Leah sat up in bed, clutching the blanket to her chest, her eyes darting to the closet. The door was still closed, but the sound seemed to be coming from behind it. She thought about calling Cassie, about asking her to come over, but what could she say? That she was hearing noises, that her phone was acting strange. Cassie would chalk it up to stress, tell her to take a break and get some sleep. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, deliberate knock. Leah's breath hitched. It wasn't the knock of wood against wood or the creak of a settling building. It sounded human, deliberate. It came again, 3 sharp taps, as though someone or something was waiting for her to respond. "Who's there?" Leah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. There was no answer, just silence. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the living room with every light in the apartment turned on, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The hours dragged by, the dark spaces of the apartment pressing in around her, until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows. When the morning came, Leah felt hollow, her nerves stretched thin. She stood at the window, staring out at the city below, watching people go about their lives as if nothing was wrong. For them, nothing was. But for her, the world was tilting, shifting into something unrecognizable. Her phone buzzed, and she flinched, almost dropping it. She forced herself to look at the screen. "You're almost ready." The message had no sender. The message haunted Leah for the rest of the day. "You're almost ready." than she wanted to admit. She stared at the screen for what felt like hours, willing herself to delete the message, to forget it. But instead, she took a screenshot. Proof, she told herself. Though proof of what, she wasn't sure. She needed air. Something about the walls of her apartment felt too close, like they were leaning in just slightly, enough to be noticeable, but not enough to call attention to themselves. Leah slipped on her shoes and jacket, her fingers fumbling with the zipper as she made her way to the door. The cold metal of the doorknob grounded her, and when she stepped outside, the rush of city noise was almost comforting. The streets bustled with the rhythm of midday. Cars idled at intersections, their exhaust curling in the crisp autumn air. People passed by with shopping bags and coffee cups, wrapped in scarves and lost in their own worlds. Leah moved through them like a ghost, her thoughts still tangled with the events of the last few days. She found herself at the same park where she'd lingered before. The bare trees cast skeletal shadows across the sidewalks, their branches trembling in the faint breeze. Leah settled onto a bench near the edge of the park, watching a group of pigeons fight over a discarded sandwich crust. The ordinary scene was a balm, a reminder that the world outside her apartment was still solid, still real. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she flinched. Pulling it out, she braced herself for another cryptic message, but it was just Cassie. "How's your day going? You okay?" Leah stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain what was happening? That she wasn't sure if she was losing her mind, or if something or someone was deliberately toying with her. "I'm fine," she typed back. "Just needed some fresh air. Let's catch up soon." Cassie's reply came almost immediately. "Soon like tonight. I'm free after 7. Drinks on me." Leah hesitated. The idea of being around someone familiar, someone real, was tempting. But the thought of explaining herself, or worse, trying to hide everything, felt exhausting. "Maybe tomorrow," she replied. "I'm wiped today." As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Across the park, near the swings, a figure stood perfectly still. They were far enough away that Leah couldn't make out any details, but their posture was wrong, too rigid, too deliberate. They didn't move, even as a jogger passed close by. It felt as if they were watching. Leah's stomach twisted. She tried to convince herself it was just another parkgoer, someone lost in thought or waiting for a friend. But as the minutes dragged on, the figure didn't leave. Leah stood abruptly, her heartbeat quickening. She forced herself to walk casually, pretending she hadn't noticed anything, but every instinct in her body screamed for her to look back. She kept moving, out of the park and onto the busier streets, blending into the stream of people until she felt a small measure of safety. When she got home, the apartment felt colder than usual. The lights she'd left on seemed dimmer, casting shadows that felt sharper and deeper than they should have. Leah locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her breath shaky. She went straight to her bedroom to grab the book she'd bought earlier in the week, hoping to lose herself in its familiar pages. But when she reached her nightstand, the book wasn't there. Her first thought was that she'd left it in the living room, maybe on the couch or the coffee table. She searched, but it wasn't anywhere. As she stood in the center of her apartment, scanning the room, a chill crawled up her spine. Something about the silence felt wrong again, too complete. And then she saw it. The book was on the floor, half hidden beneath the bed. Leah stared at it, trying to remember if she could have dropped it there. Maybe it had fallen. Maybe she'd knocked it over in her rush this morning. But as she bent to pick it up, something stopped her. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. the shadow of her reflection in the mirror across the room. It didn't match her own. Leah froze, her hand hovering over the book. She didn't dare turn her head, didn't dare confirm what she thought she'd seen. Her breath came shallow and quick, her pulse hammering in her ears. The shadow moved again, just slightly, like it was waiting for her to notice. Leah stood slowly, her gaze fixed on the mirror now, but the reflection showed nothing out of place. It was just her, standing in the room, the book on the floor at her feet. Everything was normal, everything was fine, except she hadn't moved, and yet the shadow had. Leah's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as she backed away from the mirror, her reflection now still and lifeless again. She couldn't explain what she had just seen, or thought she had seen, but the room felt wrong in a way that went beyond logic. The air was heavy, charged with something she didn't understand, and her own reflection seemed to pulse with an unspoken threat, waiting for her to look away. The apartment was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. Her eyes darted to the door, her first instinct to run. But where would she go? The thought of stepping into the hallway, with its dim lighting and endless shadows, felt just as suffocating as staying put. Her phone buzzed from the nightstand, breaking the stillness like a clap of thunder. Leah flinched, her heart hammering as she reached for it. The screen lit up, casting an eerie glow across her face. It's time. The message had no sender, no number, just those two words, glaring back at her. Leah's hands shook as she held the phone, her mind scrambling for answers. Time for what? A sudden, violent crash from the living room snapped her attention away. The sound was loud and sharp, like glass shattering. She spun toward the bedroom door, her body tensing. For a moment, she stood frozen, listening. The silence that followed was suffocating, but she could feel it. Something was out there. She took a step toward the door, then another, her bare feet soundless against the cold floor. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cool metal grounding her for just a moment. She held her breath and opened it. The living room was bathed in shadow, the overhead light flickering weakly, as if it were struggling to stay alive. The coffee table had been overturned, the glass vase that had sat atop it shattered into jagged pieces across the floor. Leah's eyes darted around the room, searching for movement, but everything was still, too still. The sound came again, this time behind her. A low, guttural creak, like wood bending under pressure. Leah whipped around, her pulse roaring in her ears. The closet door in her bedroom was open again, its dark interior yawning wide. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. There was no answer, but the shadows within the closet seemed to deepen, swirling in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the darkness itself were alive, shifting and curling at the edges, drawing her in. Her feet moved before she could stop herself, carrying her closer to the closet. She didn't want to go, didn't want to look, but something compelled her. The air grew colder with every step, biting against her skin. She stopped just outside the doorway, her breath visible in the chill. The darkness inside was absolute, impossibly deep, and for a moment she thought she saw something move. A faint ripple, like a shadow within a shadow. And then it lunged. A shape erupted from the darkness, its form indistinct but impossibly fast. Leah stumbled back, a scream catching in her throat as it came at her, a blur of shifting black and hollow eyes. The force of it knocked her to the ground, her back slamming against the bedroom wall. The thing loomed over her, its presence suffocating. Its shape was barely human, an outline of limbs and angles that didn't quite fit together, as if it had been cobbled together from the dark spaces between things. Its face, or what should have been a face, blank nothingness that made her stomach twist. Leah scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floor as she tried to put distance between them. But the thing moved with her, closing the space in an instant. It didn't touch her, but she could feel it, its weight pressing against her chest, its presence seeping into her skin like cold water. "Why are you doing this?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The thing tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow, almost curious. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a feeling, a wordless impression that pressed into her mind like a brand. "You called me." Leah's eyes widened, her breath hitching. "No," she stammered. "I didn't." The shadows around it seemed to swell, growing darker, thicker. It moved closer, and Leah's vision blurred, her body trembling with cold and fear. She tried to scream, to run, but her limbs felt heavy, pinned down by the weight of its presence. From the corner of her eye, she saw her phone, still lying on the floor where she'd dropped it earlier. The screen was glowing faintly, the same two words repeated over and over, filling the display. "It's time, it's time, it's time." Leah's hand shot out, desperate and shaking, her fingers brushing against the edge of the phone. She didn't know what she was going to do with it. Call for help, throw it, anything. But before she could grab it, the room plunged into complete darkness. And then everything went silent. Leah woke to silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the sort that cradled you in warmth and reassurance. This silence was stark and cold, stretching out like an infinite void. Her body ached, her limbs heavy, as if she'd been dragged through miles of dark water. She blinked slowly, her vision adjusting to the dim light filtering through her apartment window. She was lying on the floor of her bedroom. The closet door was shut, the mirror intact and reflecting the pale, muted daylight. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet completely different. Leah sat up slowly, her movements stiff and tentative, like her body wasn't entirely her own. Her fingers brushed the cool hardwood beneath her, grounding her, but her mind felt untethered, floating somewhere just out of reach. Her phone was still on the floor, its screen dark and unresponsive. She reached for it anyway, her hands trembling as she pressed the power button. Nothing. The weight of the previous night pressed against her chest like a vice. The shadow, the voice, the crushing cold. It wasn't a dream. She could still feel its presence lingering in the air, faint but undeniable, like the echo of a scream long since silenced. She stumbled to her feet, every muscle protesting, and made her way to the kitchen. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed weaker than usual, its warmth diluted. She turned on the faucet and splashed cold water onto her face, her reflection in the sink's steel basin rippling and fractured. When she finally looked up, her eyes darted toward the small window above the sink, catching a faint movement outside. But there was nothing, just the empty street below, the usual rhythm of the city carrying on, as if the world hadn't just unraveled beneath her feet. Leah tried to piece together the events of the night, but her memories felt fragmented, like a puzzle with missing pieces. The thing in the shadows, it had spoken to her, or maybe it hadn't. The words it pressed into her mind were still there, faint but unshakable. "You called me." Called it. How? She couldn't remember doing anything, couldn't think of a single moment where she might have invited whatever it was into her life. But as she stood there, the weight of her phone felt heavier in her hand, its blank screen an accusing silence. She thought about the messages, the strange notifications, the search suggestions she dismissed as glitches. Had it been watching her the entire time, guiding her to this point? The knock on her door jolted her out of her thoughts. It was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the apartment like a thunderclap. Leah's chest tightened. She stared at the door, her breath shallow, her feet frozen to the floor. The memory of the last knock, coming from inside her own room, surged back, sending a cold shiver down her spine. It came again, gentle, patient. Leah forced herself to move, her steps slow and deliberate as she crossed the room. She pressed her eye to the peephole, expecting, dreading, another void, another impossible figure. But the hallway outside was empty. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She couldn't bring herself to open it. The knock didn't come again. Instead, an envelope slid beneath the door, its edges crisp and clean against the scuffed floor. Leah stared at it, her heart racing, before crouching down to pick it up. The paper felt smooth and cold in her hands, and there was no writing on the outside, no indication of who had left it. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for a single line written in the center. "This isn't over." Leah dropped the paper as if it had burned her. It fluttered to the ground, the words staring up at her like an accusation. Her breath came faster, her vision narrowing, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. She backed away from the door, clutching her phone like a lifeline, though she wasn't sure who she'd even call. Cassie, the police. What could she say? What could anyone do? The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air too thick to breathe. Leah sank onto the couch, curling into herself, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. She stayed there for hours, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. When night fell, Leah found herself sitting in the dark, the faint hum of the city outside, the only sound in the room. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't dare. Her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up in the darkness. The glow illuminated her face as she stared down at the message. "See you soon." This time, she didn't delete it. She didn't throw the phone. She simply stared at the words, her fear giving way to something colder, sharper. Resolve. If it wasn't over, then neither was she. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, just slightly, as Leah's eyes adjusted to the dark. She set the phone down carefully on the coffee table, her movements deliberate, and leaned back against the couch. Whatever was coming, she would be ready, or at least she would try, because deep down, she knew she had no choice. The apartment grew quieter still, the hum of the city fading to nothing. And somewhere, just out of reach, something waited,